all for your patience in admitting everybody into the room. We hope you've had a great morning this morning, and we welcome you to this breakout session called Ethical Leadership and Professional Life. I'd like to introduce you today to our presenter, Dr. Andrew Fiala. And let me tell you a little bit about Andrew. Dr. Fiala is a professor of philosophy and the director of the Ethics Center at California State University, Fresno. He is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including Nonviolence, A Quick Immersion, published in 2020, Transformative Pacifism, which was in 2018, the Rutledge Handbook of Pacifism and Nonviolence, 2017, The Peace of Nature and the Nature of Peace, 2015, the Bloomsbury Companion to Political Philosophy in 2015. Dr. Fiala is the co-author of a widely used textbook, Ethics, Theory, and Contemporary Issues, with a co-author, Barbara McKinnon, and that is now in its 9th edition. Dr. Fiala is the past president of the Concerned Philosophers for Peace. He writes a weekly column on religion, politics, and ethics for the Fresno Bee. Quite well written and a scholar. So at this time, I'd like to welcome all of you, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fiala.
Thank you, Linda, and hi there. I'm glad that we made it in. I don't know if you guys got bumped out, but Linda and I got bumped out of the room just like 1 minute before it was supposed to start. And Linda, you're going to let people in from the waiting room, I think. So here we are. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to post in the chat a link to my website where I've posted the slides for this session. If you want to, follow along there, you can do so. Basically, I'm going to use some PowerPoint slides, and I'm going to put you in some breakout rooms at some point to give you a chance to talk to each other. I enjoyed this morning's sessions, but it's very passive. So what I'm going to do with all of you is make you argue with each other. Hopefully that'll be a little bit fun, and some of it's going to kind of, hit home because these are like ripped from the headline things I want you to argue about. And one of the things I'm going to try to work through with you is how to have good arguments and think about things from a standpoint of civility and focused on ethics and so on. So I'm sharing my screen with you now. Hopefully you guys can all see that. And I can see my good friend, Professor Benega. Somehow you're like the top guy there, Jack. So thank you for nodding. Anyway, if you want to get a hold of me or whatever, here's my info. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at Fresno State. So I do a lot of these kind of presentations. I could do like 8 hours of this, or I could do it in 20 minutes. So here's my 1 hour version. Well, hopefully it'll be interactive and you can have a little bit of fun in the conversation as we proceed. So let me play from the start. You can probably see that a little bit better now. Moving on. So here's what I propose for all of you, that leadership requires ethics, and good leaders embody key virtues. We'll talk about those a little bit. We want to talk about how good leaders build consensus around shared values. And this is a certain model of leadership that I'm going to be talking about with you. And I'll show you the alternative, because there are other ways that one could be a leader, unethical ways, frankly. And then good leaders encourage their organizations and respond to the world in ethical ways, respond to the challenges of the moment in ethical ways. So what I'm going to do with you, 3 parts for our hour here. First, we're going to talk generally about ethical leadership. Then we'll talk a little bit about ethical decision making. And then finally, I want to talk about professional ethics and ethical culture with you. Some of this stuff actually came up this morning in some of the sessions. So hopefully it'll be a little bit, that kind of wrapping or spiraling kind of learning. Hopefully some of this will resonate with you, both in your own lives and what we heard this morning. So very quickly, and again, we could spend an hour and a half talking about this one thing, but I have been for like 5 or 10 years now actively promoting civility and civil discourse. we've lost this skill in our culture. Parts of our culture have lost this skill. Let me put it that way. Some of us continue to do a good job at this. And actually, I know the audience here, the educational professionals, you guys are actually good at this. So in fact, a lot of what we're going to talk about here, you already know how to do this. I don't presume to, wave my finger at you and lecture you and scold you and say, do this. You already do it. So kind of what we'll do as we proceed is just think through and talk over things that you already know about. You're adults, professionals working in the community. Anyways, civil discourse. If you wanted, I could send you, I have a little bookmark with all of this stuff on it, with the Ethics Center bookmark on civil discourse. The gist of this is you have to listen, think, learn, trust, wonder, build, and seek. If we had those kind of dispositions, we'd be better off. And instead, what I've seen, I don't know if this is true for you, but what I've seen in our world and in parts of our culture is the opposite of all of this. A lot of talking, very little listening. A lot of accusations, very little attempt to understand. And really, not much respect, not much caring, and so on. I think, again, you educators, we understand how important this stuff is. We're going to try to work through this and model it as we proceed. Again, if we had 3 hours, I'd go through this entire slide with you. But let me tell you, I came up with an A to Z list of the virtues of civility. You can find this on the Ethics Center website if you're interested. A couple, just kind of at random, pick a couple of these ideas and think about how important these ideas are. Let's start with the first one under A, agreeableness. To be willing to go along with someone at least part of the way of the journey, right? To be willing to listen to someone and to nod in agreement, even if you fundamentally disagree, but to be able to listen to what others suggest long enough to understand where they're coming from. Look across the top, honesty, number 10 there in terms of my alphabetical list. One has to be able to speak the truth honestly, without exaggeration, without hyperbole, and we have to be honest about what we don't understand, right? Often, like part of the problem in our culture is people fly off the handle and they haven't honestly listened to what other people say, et cetera, all the way down to number 26 with Z. I had to get something with a Z, zest, to bring some energy, to bring some vigor to our conversations. You know, one of the problems, a different sort of problem of civility is just absolute passivity, where people just nod and shrug but don't actually actively listen or actively engage. So these are the kind of things that I want to kind of have us work with as we're working on some case studies here in a few minutes. One more that I share in workshops and so on is like basic critical thinking skills with these key questions. Is it fair? Is it true? And does it make sense? Things go wrong when we fail at any of those three levels. There's obviously much more to it, but again, if we're going to have civil conversations, if we're going to have professional conversations, we need to keep thinking about fairness, about truth, and about the basic logic and internal consistency of our claims. Okay, that was like fast and furious introduction to where I'm coming from and what I value. Now, why does this matter? So what I'm going to share with you in our hour here are a couple of examples ripped from the headlines. Here's one from just last week. Did you see that over in Oakley, California, it's in the Bay Area near Antioch, the Oakley Union School District, every one of the school district members resigned in shame just a couple days ago. I don't know if you were aware of this. It's crazy. And this is part of the problem of our culture. And it's a problem that's created by our communications technology in part. Here's the story. The school board was meeting. They thought that they were in a private Zoom. They weren't aware that the Zoom meeting was open to the public. They thought they were speaking amongst themselves, and they said some outrageous and terrible things about their own constituents. You know, basically bad-mouthing the members of their district, the parents, and so on. Well, it turned out this was a public Zoom. People heard it, and the entire school board resigned. I think that's the right thing. Oops, I skipped ahead too soon. I think that was probably the right move. I think that that resignation was merited. And actually, like, this is a good news story. It's a disaster, but the good news is the school board members took responsibility for their actions. And if you read at the bottom, that last paragraph, there was an apology, there was an admittance that they had done wrong, and then the resignation. I'm going to have you talk about this in a discussion room in just a second. So keep this one in mind. What did they do the right thing by resigning and by admitting fault and taking responsibility for their misdeeds? Okay, well, I'll have you return to that in a couple minutes. So part one of this discussion, leadership ought to be ethical leadership. And almost always when people are talking about leadership in these kind of workshops, and I'm sure you've gone to others of these, it's a certain kind of leadership that's presumed, although there are various styles of leadership. The one that I think is most important in our culture and in our profession as educators is ethical leadership. It's not just about being a leader, it's about being a good person that builds up the best in your, among the stakeholders, and that contributes to society at large. Leadership in this sense is good leadership. Notice the title of this book, Transforming Leadership. I'll share this with you in a second. This model might be subsumed under the category of so-called transformational leadership, which is different from what we might call transactional leadership. Management is often transactional leadership, or people misunderstand it in that sense. Here's a quote from Steve Jobs, you know, Apple Computer. He says, management is about persuading people to do things they do not want to do, while leadership is about inspiring people to do things they never thought they could. The inspirational aspect of that is important. Okay, so here's some values that we might associate with leadership. And this came up this morning. You know, I don't know if you heard this morning, there was like a long discussion about boldness in leadership, the bold, Dr. Castro and so on. So bold, charismatic, inspiring, visionary, courageous, strong, disciplined. These are leadership qualities that we see in really bad leaders, to be honest. These virtues, if they're not associated with other ethical values, these kind of virtues can lead to disaster. The bold leader who is not grounded in an ethical vision of the world, we end up with all kinds of problems. And let me bring in a quote from everyone's favorite bad leader, or maybe second favorite evil leader, Mussolini. Mussolini said this: "We become strong when we have no friends upon whom to lean or to look to for moral guidance." That's a problem. Notice, by the way, there's a hint here about good leadership, which is that good leaders have good friends who offer them good moral guidance and feedback that's grounded in values other than boldness, vision, courage, and the rest of it. My point again, and you get this, I'm sure you understand this, it's not enough to be bold, one also has to be good, with all kinds of interesting questions about that. So let me share with you a couple of basic ideas about ethics and leadership. And then in just a couple minutes, I'm going to give you a discussion activity. I'm going to give you one more case study and then a discussion activity. So ethical behavior is essential for living well. Aristotle said this. You are not surprised if you're a professional working in the world, you understand that we need ethical behavior at all levels within organizations. Organizations fail, scandals erupt when there are bad habits, when there is a lack of a commitment to ethics and a larger vision of happiness and living well. This is true at all levels of organizations, and the organizations need to reinforce and teach and value the kinds of virtues and role models that we're looking for within organizations. One of the things we'll talk about towards the end of our hour is how do we create organizations that actually do this? This is what I call ethical culture. Fundamental to this vision is the idea that ethics can be taught. Aristotle famously said that ethics is second nature. We're born with a certain biological status, certain intellectual abilities, but ethics has to be learned. If you're an educator, I guarantee you believe this at some level. The reason we're in this business is because we want to teach people how to be human beings. And that involves teaching them how to be ethical, how to develop habits, behaviors, and attitudes, and so on. Mike Irwin talked about this in part this morning with regard to solitude and reflection and so on. The last sort of thesis for you that I want to share, that there is a sense of responsibility to society, both inside and outside. Organizations, especially educational organizations, don't exist in a vacuum, right? There are stakeholders, both internal and external, and all of that has to be taken into account. Social justice, et cetera, and especially concern for those who are less well off and those who need extra support. This is my proposal about what ethical leadership looks like and why it's important. Quick slide about the leadership literature. Two big differences that often pulled apart in leadership literature: transactional leadership versus transformational leadership. There's a variety of other ways that this stuff is explained. Transactional leadership is management. It's that sort of, let me punish you or reward you to get you to perform. This can be disastrous. It's obviously some organizations need this. We probably all need a little bit of the transactional in our lives, right? A few rewards, a few punishments. But ultimately, it's the transformational style of leadership that I'm talking about. And that's where ethics comes in, where the point is that the leaders themselves embody the virtues and values of the organization. And there is a larger vision of the good life and human flourishing and happiness and so on. Okay, my guess is that, if you're an educator at this stage in your life, you understand all of this. You understand the importance of transformational leadership. Let me pause for a second and just point out, it's not only at work, it's also in families. It's also in political culture, right? Good husbands and wives, good friends and partners. It can't just be transactional, right? There has to be some set of shared values. Okay, I'm going to pause for just a second. And I'm going to ask you to write, brainstorm, think about 3 ethical leaders and what are some of their qualities. I'm going to give you a minute. Write something down, think it through. 3 role models of leadership, 5 qualities or virtues of good leadership. And when I put you in a breakout room, I'm going to have you discuss this. Okay, that's probably not enough time. I realize that. You'll have a chance to talk this over in the breakout room in just a minute or two. Because one of the things I want you to talk about in the breakout room are those ethical qualities. Who has them, who embodies them, and why do you admire them for those qualities? In order to make that conversation much more difficult and challenging, let me give you a case study. So, and this may hit home for some of you, and that's okay. And one of the things I started out with that conversation about civility and trying to listen and model our values. Well, so I don't know if you read the Fresno Bee or paid attention to this local issue, but there was this public dispute between Gary Bredefeld and Bob Nelson. Gary Bredefeld, Fresno City Council member, Bob Nelson, Fresno Unified Superintendent. Some of you may work in this district. We want to try to talk about this and think about this in the spirit of learning. What can we learn from this public dispute about leadership, about ethics, and so on? So if you're not up to speed on this, Gary Bredefeld introduced a resolution to sue Fresno Unified School District in order to allow in-class instruction to begin again, right after the COVID issue. As Bredefeld's resolution put it, the last paragraph here, the Fresno Unified School District School Board and Superintendent Bob Nelson have been complicit in the damage to these children by keeping the schools closed. No more dithering, no more lack of plans to open, no more bowing before the teachers union or Governor Newsom. Prioritize the needs of our children and open the schools now. You saw this or heard this within the last week or two. Okay. Then Superintendent Nelson tweeted, and so one of the interesting questions here is, how do we behave on Twitter? So I'll show you there. This went both ways. So Superintendent Nelson said, so how is the current two-party system working for you, Fresnans? Nothing like politicizing an issue as serious as a safe and responsible return to schools in order to rally a support base. The only thing this release lacked was face paint, Viking horns, and a Chewbacca onesie. I'm going to want you to talk about this in your breakout room in a second. Is this a good response by Superintendent Nelson? Well, Councilman Bredefeld did not like it. So he tweeted back, pathetic response, just like your leadership over the past year. Your job is to educate and facilitate the development of 70,000 children. You've failed miserably, as has your board. You've bowed to union, your board, and ignored kids and their parents' pleas for help. Disgraceful. Okay, you get this. And this, by the way, we could have used any example that we've seen the last, 10 years of this kind of public back and forth. And notice at issue here is a question of leadership. Who's a good leader in this case? Is it Bob Nelson? Is it Gary Bredefeld challenging Bob Nelson's leadership? What kind of values and virtues would we like to see embodied in either case? The case of the city council, the case of the superintendent, and so on. You understand where we're going with this. In just a second, I'm going to allow you to talk with friends about this. Finally, you may have seen then what happened. So the resolution was introduced. The city council voted it down 4-3. And if you're interested, the three that voted in favor of the resolution were Bredefeld, Mike Carbasi, and Esmeralda Soria. So there you have it. This is the Fresno dispute of the moment. It seems like there's another one every week or two. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms now. And here's what I want you to talk about for a few minutes. We're not going to be able to then do a follow-up, and I'm not going to be able to ask for contributions because we got started a little late. We're not going to have time for that. But I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, probably won't be long enough. How should good leaders communicate? What is required of ethical leaders in a crisis such as we're in? What about public disputes and ongoing crises? If you want, you could talk about that city council meeting also, the school district meeting where they all resigned as a result. What kind of institutional changes, ethical culture, could help in all of these kind of disputes? And then go back, if you want, to the question of who your role models are, what those role models stand for and what they believe in. Okay, so in order to make this happen, I'm going to open up some breakout rooms. We've got 43 participants. So what if we make, I put you in about 5 or 6 people per room, and it's your turn to talk. So all morning we've been talking at you. I'm going to give you 5 or 6 minutes to talk about this stuff or anything else you want, frankly. You are now being invited to a room. I'll give you a warning, and then we'll reconvene in about 5 or 6 minutes. Have fun and be civil. Linda, how are we doing with this? You're on mute.
I turned myself. Everybody's been admitted right away. And I know a couple of people had been flipped out, didn't have sound. The link was resent. They got back in, so they're going on there.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think everybody who's in, who wants in, is in.
Good. And you have to duck out, you said, at some point?
I'm trying to stay a little longer to see if more are coming. let me duck out for 1 minute. I'm going to put myself on stop video and mute. Let me go do a check-in, and then I'll come right back if I can.
Okay, and then I mean, I'm happy. We're still going to end it at 1:30 because I know there's other sessions, so that's
Right.
fine. And I can keep track of the time myself. If you don't come back, in other words, I'm
Okay.
cool. I can manage it.
Okay. And I'm interested in getting some information. I see how some of this also dovetails beautifully in some of the courses, that because the whole thing is around, I mean, they have to do a whole piece on ethics related to their assessment for the state as well as for the courses. And so I think we should probably have a little meeting together.
Sure. Yeah, no, if you ever need a guest lecture, I'm happy to do that too.
Actually, that wouldn't be I'll make a suggestion to the ones that have the courses that, I mean, we put this in every single course. You want to have that because they always need to address how ethically they're leading in whatever area it is, whether it's in the curriculum area, whether it's in as they're supporting teachers for their professional growth and development, whether it's in the community, but some of the classes have more emphasis, and that might be a really good place to connect up.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. It's kind of my job as director of the Ethics Center. I do a lot of these workshops and lectures. So yeah, keep me in mind.
Okay, great. And it was great to officially meet you in person.
Yeah, you too. Nice to meet you.
Kind of in person. Okay, I'll duck out. And if I'm not back, then I think I think anybody who's probably going to join is already in.
And I know how to do that too, so I can keep.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
All right, see you later. So welcome back. Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Are we all back? Everybody back with us? Okay, here. So if that was easy, then you did it wrong. Let me point this out. These conversations are supposed to be challenging and difficult. Again, if we had a lot of time, we would, we'd be able to debrief this and have a really good argument and share our ideas about this. That's not what we're going to be able to do today, especially because we had a late start and so on. Let me just point out why I think these kind of conversations are useful, right? We sort of implicitly know all of this stuff, right? If you're living in the world and if you're working in an organization, you understand something about leadership and something about ethics. If you're married and have friends and are a parent and are a teacher in the classroom, you get this, right? It's useful to have an occasional chance to reflect and think about this stuff and dig a little bit deeper. So that's all I'm doing with you here today. Okay, I don't propose, it's nothing like brand new that I'm proposing for you. So part two of my my workshop for you, we're going to look at ethical decision making, and we're going to do this super fast, and it's going to be very superficial. But here's the thing. Most people already know how to do this implicitly. There are huge problems in the world when we don't understand what we're doing when we make decisions. So it's often good to step back and just understand all the places things could go wrong, okay? So here's a sort of framework or matrix that I've come up with, and I'm not the only person that ever thought this stuff up. If you're looking for resources along these lines, there's lots of stuff. I'll share with you a couple books at some point here in a minute or so. Santa Clara University has a really great ethics center where they do this work. Santa Clara University actually has an app, a ethical decision-making app, where you can put these little sliders and then it tells you what the right decision is. A little bit silly, a little bit cheesy, but it's a reminder about how to think, right? Questions to ask yourself. First of all, what are the facts of the matter? Seems obvious that we want to get the facts straight, but as you know, these days people disagree about facts. So that already shows us how difficult this could be. What are the facts? Second thing, who has an obligation to do what and how much? There's a problem of busybodies. Some people butt in where it's not their business. Some people don't butt in when it is their business, right? We'll talk about that in a different context in a bit. Third thing, where do your values come from? And fourth, these two go together, what do you believe fundamentally about what matters with regard to ethics? Turns out people disagree about this. There's a lot of overlap, but there are conflicts, which takes us to number 5, that there can be big conflicts of value. And then number 6, as we're making ethical decisions, reflect, reassess, reform, apologize when you make a mistake. And guess what? Everyone makes mistakes. There's nobody who hasn't made an ethical mistake in their life. You may have heard this thing, the cover-up is worse than the crime. The best thing is admit when you make a mistake, go back, try to fix it. One of the ways to fix it is to think of ways to change institutions so that institutions support ethical decision-making in a more robust manner. I'm not going to have any time to go into these details of this slide. If you wanted to take a workshop that was 2 or 3 hours long, we could go over this. But let me point out this to you, that there are different theories of ethics in the world. One that most people know implicitly is the so-called utilitarian theory of ethics. The utilitarian theory tells us we should maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This theory conflicts with other theories such as libertarian and natural law theories. Let me show you how this works. And the point of this brief conversation is to point out that there are deep and profound ethical conflicts. Libertarian theories emphasize autonomy, liberty, freedom, the importance of consent. Now, some of the big conflicts in our public life, like helmet laws for motorcyclists, seatbelt laws, smoking ordinances, those issues reflect a dispute between libertarians and utilitarians. The libertarians say, leave me alone to make my own mistakes. I don't want to wear a motorcycle helmet. I don't want to wear a seatbelt. I want to smoke. The utilitarians say, no, in the name of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, we're going to have regulations about helmets, seatbelts, smoking, and so on. That's one example of how this occurs. Here's the takeaway. Again, we don't have time to go through all of these issues, but there are fundamental disputes of ethics in the world. And these things show up in real world conversations. And if we can put a name on it and a label and understand what the conflict is about, sometimes that's helpful. Okay, if that slide wasn't crazy enough, how about this one? So this is the cover of a book on ethical decision-making in education. The point of this, why I want to bring this in, is to show you that there is lots of complexity in the ways that we understand ethics in professional life. There are standards of conduct, codes of ethics. There's your own code of ethics that sometimes may conflict with the standards of your profession. There's right in the front here, the best interests of the student. There's ethical issues in the community. Here's the takeaway from this slide. It's very difficult to have a coherent and consistent approach to ethical life. If you feel pulled in different directions, good, you're paying attention. Right? The reality of being a good person is that it's difficult because there are all of these conflicting theories, conflicting values, conflicting obligations. Okay, here's one way to sort this out. There's this guy, Rushworth Kidder. He's now deceased, but he was a great kind of public teacher of ethics and ethical decision-making. He gives us this very useful language, the difference between a dilemma and a temptation. By the way, you could take this to your students or to your husband and wife because this comes in handy. So a dilemma is when there's a conflict between two good things, between two right things. That conflict between utilitarians and libertarians about helmets and smoking and so on, that's a kind of dilemma, right? The libertarian says, leave me alone to make my own mistakes. The utilitarian says, in the name of the greater good, we're going to limit your liberty. That's a kind of dilemma, okay? Temptation is different. A temptation is when you know it's wrong, but you want to do it anyway. You know this, right? You've used the word temptation before. Here's one of the things that happens in our, in ethical life, is sometimes we want to turn temptations into dilemmas so that we can do basically just what we want to do, right? So it's useful to sort out the difference. The reason I said, students or husbands and wives, the husband suggests, honey, we're going to go to Las Vegas and anything goes in Las Vegas. Well, that's probably a temptation and not a dilemma. And if the husband comes back and says, but wait a minute, there's two good things here, our marriage and Las Vegas, it's not really a dilemma, is it? Okay, you get the point of this. Rushworth Kidder provides us with 4 paradigms or 4 ways of thinking about dilemmas. Truth versus loyalty, right? This in terms of secrets and so on. Individual versus community. That's kind of the libertarian versus utilitarian conflict. Short-term versus long-term. Justice versus mercy. You know this, I have this every semester. I'm sure you have too. Kid cheats, something goes wrong, they plagiarism or whatever, and then they beg for mercy. And sometimes I'm compelled, like, oh man, I should I should help that individual student. But justice and fairness requires something else, and it's a kind of a dilemma, a conflict, okay? I'm sure you understand this implicitly in your own lives. Okay, last slide, and then I'm going to give you another discussion activity. So one of the important things in professional ethics is how do we connect all of that ethical decision-making stuff to what's required of us by our jobs. Notice that there are standards within professional life that may be different from what we actually believe individually. You remember that slide I showed you, all those conflicting spheres. But when you sign up for a job, when you affiliate yourself with a profession, there are things you're required to do. You know this as educators, mandatory reporting if you discover child abuse and so on, right? There are things you have to do, even if it feels like it conflicts with your ethical, oops, I skipped ahead too soon. Even if it conflicts with your ethical, your sense of self, right? Your deep-seated personal values. If you fail to do what's required by your profession, we're going to call that negligence, right? And you can get in big trouble for this, right? If you fail due diligence and due care, the standards that are required of you by your profession. Let me give you a philosophy word that you may find fun. You can use this one against your husband or wife later on. This word, supererogation. It's a great philosophy word. It means going above and beyond the call of duty. Supererogatory acts are extra good. There's an interesting question in all of this. How good are we required to be? Certainly we don't want to fall below the standards of negligence, but how far beyond that are we required to go if we're going to call ourselves a good person or a good professional? Okay, all of that, now just to remind you, I'm going to give you a couple case studies. So we looked at ethical decision-making strategies, dilemmas, temptations, individual versus community, and so on. So here's a couple of case studies involving cheating. I'm going to ask you to talk about these in groups in just a second. Did you see that around the world, as a result of online learning, there's been massive cheating scandals? This one, and it's not the only military academy where you saw this pop up, but this one at the Air Force was reported recently in the Air Force magazine. I'll read it to you. The U.S. Air Force Academy has kicked out students and reprimanded others after nearly 250 cadets were suspected of using online learning to cheat on tests and plagiarize assignments last spring. So it's the online environment that causes this. Last paragraph, the online learning presented opportunities for students to game the system away from the watchful eyes of professors, other cadets, and a wall bearing the school's honor code. We will not lie, steal, or cheat, nor tolerate among us anyone who does. Okay, interesting. There's an honor code there. They're all expected to live up to it, and they violate it. Then we've also seen cheating scandals where educators themselves are cheating. I don't know if you're aware of these, but people go to jail because of this, where administrators and teachers are helping students cheat on standardized tests, or themselves doing the cheating, erasing answers and so on. There's been a number of these scandals that have popped up in recent time. And one of the issues that has come up in this conversation, and if you're interested, please follow that link and check out this report from NPR from a year or so ago. One of the worries is that in administering the standards, it tends to have an effect that also spills over into social justice concerns. What if in, struggling schools, some teachers are engaged in these, in cheating? What should be done about that? And how do we then think about the kind of conflicting issues about achievement, accountability in education, and so on? Okay, cheating scandals, both students and among educators. Let me put you in groups again and just have you talk briefly about cheating. And the question is, what should you do if you suspect that there is cheating going on, either among educators or among students? Who has an obligation to do what? And then how do we resolve that, that issue in our organizations? And how do we create organizations that are responsible for all of this? I'm going to open the rooms again. I'll give you a couple of, maybe like 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll conclude. So the rooms are open for you to go have a conversation about cheating. Linda,
Hello.
you're back?
I was, and actually about 3 more people came. So
Okay,
I entered them as well. So,
good.
yeah.
I think I got everyone. I checked my list. There a few who came late were not assigned to those discussion rooms, so I was able to
Oh,
do
okay.
that. So,
Yep. Too bad there's not more time. This is good. This is very good.
yeah, no, I mean, this issue about the educators themselves cheating, it's, I understand that my wife's a teacher, a fourth
Oh,
grade
where is she
teacher,
a teacher?
and I understand the pressures.
Where is she a teacher at?
She teaches at King Elementary in Fresno Unified,
Oh, yeah. How long's she been there?
maybe 7 or 8 years.
Oh, I missed her then. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, she loves that school.
Yeah. Oh, it is. It
It's
is.
a life that, I mean, like she is just in the community there,
I
'cause there's a
wonder
lot of
if
need.
it's still there. At that school, there was a daughter, a mother, and a husband. There was like a whole family who taught there.
Yeah, the Tatum, there is
Yes, that's it. That's it.
Mr. and Mrs. Tatum, and I think their son is now a teacher, maybe at Gaston around the corner.
Okay, okay. Because in different school districts, there's different regulations around who can be on the same campus with
Interesting.
you. Like in Clovis, because I've been in both locations, and one with a union and one not a union, and just the different kinds of processes there. But if you have any kind of, I think it's more or less blood relative, like, a son, daughter, well, husband, wife wouldn't be. And in Clovis, you could not be at the same campus.
Oh,
You
okay.
can be in the district, you just can't be on the same campus.
This is one of those ethical questions, because in that community, I know that Mr. and Mrs. Tatum, like they live in that, they're part of that community.
They
It's kinda
are.
cool.
Yeah. I just know when going out there and having the whole family that was right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna, that was not really enough time for them to talk, I know. I'm gonna close these rooms again, and then I'll conclude here
Okay.
in a few minutes.
I'll add anybody else, if anybody else.
So as you guys are coming back in, I know that wasn't enough time to have a good conversation about that. So I apologize for speeding it up here, but we got a late start, and I think we should end on time so that, because you guys all have other things going on in your lives besides sitting here with me. So let me put my, I think we got everyone back. I'm going to go back to screen share and just offer a couple of concluding thoughts, and then I'm happy to hang out and talk further if you want, but we'll try to end on time. One of the things that, if we had a little more time, I'd share with you is about professionalism in general. You saw this in some of the examples we looked at. Professionals represent the profession to the world. When teachers do bad things, the world starts to think a certain way about teachers. When nurses do bad things, the world starts to think a certain way about nurses. Let me just share this bit of data with you. The Gallup poll has been tracking most trusted professions for years, and teachers tend to come up at the top end. Nurses, doctors, pharmacists, and then teachers in 2018. Can you guess who's at the bottom? Look down there. You'll see car salesmen and members of Congress. as the least trusted people in the world. I think, and by the way, I don't think that members of Congress are any worse or better than anyone else. The thing is, they're in the news a lot. So we hear a lot about what goes on with them. That's one of my suspicions about this. And the thing is about all of this, the public perception really matters. So here's more recent data from 2020, nurses, doctors, grade school teachers, pharmacists, and so on, lawyers at the bottom. The list went down longer. I just grabbed this part. Here's one important takeaway moment. Whatever you do in your professional life, you are representing your profession to the world. By the way, it's not only at work. And this is a huge moment, eye-opening moment. If you get arrested for drunk driving, guess what the headline is going to say? Fresno teacher, Clovis teacher gets arrested for drunk driving, right? They're going to lead with that. So it actually puts a whole lot of pressure on us in terms of professionals. Our lives, in a sense, when we enter into professions, our lives are no longer our own, right? We represent the profession to the rest of the world, which puts a lot of burden on people. And in the era of social media, you know, all these issues about like your former posts on Facebook when you were in college and you did some outlandish things and now it kind of reflects back upon you. And that's just the reality of being a professional, right? You have taken this on and you manifest it yourself. Let's go back to where we started in terms of that school board in Oakley, the Oakley School District, right? They, as school board members, are representing the community, right? Certain behavior is expected of them. Whether they thought that was in private or in public, they had an obligation, I would argue, to behave better than that, right? To not badmouth their constituents. And frankly, my interpretation of that event, again, is I think that it was wise that they resigned. That sent a strong message about values, and maybe the children in that community learned something about ethics from that episode. There's lots and lots of difficulties in organizations. I'm not going to go through all of this to you, but just to remind you that organizations like Wells Fargo, there's a big ethical scandal there. Well, there's been more than one. Bernie Madoff and the scandal involving financial planning and so on. There's lots of ways that things could go wrong. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but let me suggest this as a takeaway. As you're thinking about leadership in your own organization, very important to think about who's the ethics advocate, who is speaking up in meetings and in structural, who is the person in your organization that is talking and thinking about this stuff. There should be a role in every organization for a so-called ethical advocate, someone that's going to just raise these issues and ask if what we're doing is the right thing. We all have an obligation to think about that on our own, but organizations have a special obligation to cultivate and reward ethical behavior, to do training, and to punish when necessary in appropriate ways and so on. Let me skip to the end so we can end on time. I think we're about on time, maybe a little bit late. So here's my conclusion. You know, I've been teaching this stuff and doing these workshops for years, decades, a decade or more of this kind of work. There's always a problem somewhere. I never have a problem finding these ripped from the headlines. I mean, all I have to do is Google ethics and there's some controversy somewhere. But here's the good news, I think, is that as we see and learn from these things, we do better. So we don't want to ignore the dilemmas. We don't want to ignore the temptations, but we want to learn from them. And I think we have to have the hope that by studying this stuff and thinking about it, we can do better in the world. Okay, I'm gonna stop there and wish you all a good afternoon. I'm happy to hang out and talk for a little while if you want, but it's 1:30 and I'm a big fan of ending on time. So let me conclude. I'm happy to talk further if you want, but if you want to leave, feel free. We'll see you later.